for dark nights.
Milk Teeth. Written by Colby Newton. Narrated by Heather Ordover. The river had broken its banks and seeped onto the abandoned highway. The shallow, rippling pools played with the flat wheels of the bus, splashing upon the rusted hubcaps and weathered undercarriage. Tendrils of vine and leaves gripped the contours of the metal cab, stemming from the cracks in the submerged pavement. Claire Collingwood stumbled her way through the murky shadows, fighting to remain standing as the water clung to her dress and pulled the fabric already stretched tightly over her bloated abdomen. For a moment, she hesitated, absent-mindedly holding her belly in one hand and a knife in the other. She considered the bus. There would be no way to ensure her safety once she was inside. The glass windows and flimsy door would offer little protection from the weather. But this did not concern Claire as much as the thought of how easy it would be for them to get in. She contemplated finding a different location, but another pulsating stab racked her abdomen, and she abandoned any thought of traveling further along the deserted road. With her mind set, she pushed on through the water, careful to hold the knife away from her body in case she fell. The door was rusted shut, but with some prying, she was able to wedge it open enough to budge in. Pulling it closed behind her, she was slightly comforted by the door's reluctance to move. At least, this would make for somewhat of an obstacle. A human body, or what was left of the tortured remains, occupied the first seat behind the driver's. She only gave it a momentary glance before carefully making her way toward the back of the bus. After making sure she was alone, she gathered the abandoned clothing left scattered among the seats. Finding a seat near the middle of the bus, she made a bed on top of the cushion. But before she could lie down, she looked at the window just above the seat and pictured one of them peering in at her. Claire shivered and moved the clothing to the floor between the seats. Maneuvering herself slowly, she reclined onto the makeshift bed, pulling her dress above her knees. Saying a silent prayer, she bit down on the handle of the knife and began to push. 15 years earlier, Claire Collingwood would never have imagined herself giving birth alone in a rusted bus. She had been a fresh, young face in the medical field, aimed at making a difference in the world. Everything at the time had been new and exciting as she prepared to make her mark as a nurse at one of the leading hospitals in the country. She had met her husband, Marcus, after he contracted a parasite while building wells for villages in Africa. An ambitious man, he was quick to charm the young nurse, despite looking like death and wearing only a paper gown. Although she despised the thought of his body harboring insects, she couldn't help but be taken by the man, as dreamy-eyed as she was. A year later, the two were married and prepared to build a life together. By that time, she had moved up in the chain of command and worked with a team designated for unusual cases. She still remembered how it all started. In the years since, she had devised her own poem to remember the sequence of events that ended the world. Now Claire recited the verses in her head, exchanging the Lord's Prayer for his punishment.
Their bellies had all flattened, and none had come to seed.
It had been in the news for a few months, here and there an unusually high occurrence of miscarriages, followed by concentrated populations of infertility. Insidiously, these incidences happened more and more frequently, spreading like a virus.
Upon the breath of every man, dark words to be freed.
People were panicked, blaming everything they could name. Pollution, global warming, damnation, and terrorists had been on everybody's lips. The president told people not to panic, that he knew medical professionals were close to identifying the cause of the threat. Claire, however, had known this to be a lie. No one knew what was happening. Nevertheless, these events had only been the ill preparation for what was to come.
Then the month of May, when milk teeth grew no more.
One day, rumors began to spread that no children were being born. At first, appearing to be the hysterics of a crippled world, people tried to deny their greatest fear. Of course children were still being born. They'd always been born. But soon, it became apparent that what had once been was no more. For the first time in recorded history, not a single human being was born in a day's passing. That day led to another, and another, and another. A year passed without any births, and the world cried in pain. While society spun apart, Claire and Marcus had kept each other sane. In their innocence, they thought they could still make a difference and bring an end to the chaos. They still went on dates, catching some of the last movies to be produced, and never abandoned the hope of a return to normalcy.
Until the night the dryness ended, seed replaced with spore.
On one evening, she awoke with an impending feeling of doom. For the first time, Claire Collingwood was not her optimistic self. At first she was unsure of what had awoken her. She lay still, listening to the sound of Marcus breathing. Then she heard her pager vibrate on the nightstand. The message demanded she go to the hospital, but offered no other explanation. When she arrived, a heavy silence hung over the ward. Doctors were whispering quietly, gathered around the doorway of room 419. Claire wringed her hands as she approached, noticing a look on the doctors' faces that she did not recognize. They only looked up when she came within arm's reach. "We're about to begin," one said, not bothering to greet her. "Begin with what, sir?" She was beginning to decipher the emotion blanketing their faces, and her unease grew. "Delivering a child." The reply came from a different doctor after the first had simply stared at her. Now she understood what she saw in these men. Fear. The same primeval, guttural fear that had gripped their ancestors now coursed through the bodies of these men. Claire's own emotions no longer seemed irrational, though she did not know why she felt so threatened. They moved into the room before she had a chance to question what they were saying. She followed, taking in a strangely tepid scene. There wasn't anything intimidating about the expectant mother. She seemed genuinely excited, if not a little confused herself. A smile was pressed upon her face, and she was slowly looking about the room. Eyes locked in position, her head pivoted in sweeping motions, as if she were following a particularly slow fly. "Hello, I'm Claire. I'll be one of the nurses helping you with your delivery tonight." The woman offered no sign of acknowledgement. Confused, Claire looked over at one of the doctors, who shook his head when they locked eyes. The scene she had once labeled as surprisingly plain now seemed to be a mask for something more sinister.
A perfume You master poison, deception none could name.
Claire staggered back in horror as she turned back to the woman. She was no longer smiling, nor did she seem confused. Her eyes gazed into Claire's, and she quietly said, "It's time." Her head then jolted back, and a tormented howl burst from her lips. The doctors jumped into motion, preparing tools and grabbing gloves. It only started seconds ago, but as the woman's screams escalated, so did the feeling of doom. Just as it began to seem as though the terror couldn't be more intense, the woman fell back onto the gurney, dead. At the foot of the bed, the doctors were gaping at a writhing form. Claire pulled the woman's gown up to look at it and screamed. She knew what it was. They all knew what it was. However, none of them dared to say it. One of the doctors reached a hand to the child, fingertips quivering.
And through the blood it came to be, for the world it was to claim.
Claire ran down the hall, blood splattered across her face. She could taste the doctor's gore in her mouth, how it had snatched at him, ensnaring him, had finally broken Claire Collingwood's hope for redemption. She now knew that things would not get any better. They had only just begun. Marcus had not seen it and didn't understand why his wife insisted on leaving the city. He would later regret asking her to stay and consider their options. More women were starting to give birth, and as it spread, so did the carnage. Soon they were infesting the cities, waiting in the shadows for those who were left behind. The couple ran for nearly a decade, scavenging what they could. They met fewer people every year, and the time between conversations with strangers continued to grow. If it hadn't been for Marcus, Claire would have joined those hanging by their shoelaces in the forest. He remained hopeful, despite all they had seen. As if to reward him for his faith, a spark of hope began to shine in the people they encountered. News was spreading of women beginning to have normal children again. Although doubtful, Claire was ready for some change in the monotony, and Marcus was set to take all the necessary precautions. But he had never gotten the chance. A few months into her pregnancy, he was killed, and Claire was left alone with their unborn child. Suicide crossed her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Marcus would tell her to at least have the child. She owed it to him for all the years he saved her life. She was determined to bring the child into the world, and she spent the next few months clinging to life, focused only on her purpose. Finally, the time came, and her body began to respond, just as she found the abandoned bus. The sun had set some time ago, settling the forest into a still silence. As it grew darker, Claire's contractions came more frequently, and she alternated between pushing and resting. The thought of taking a quick nap crossed her mind when she heard it. A small splash from outside, so quiet that it was almost mist, froze the air in her lungs. It could just be the wind blowing the water across a stone. A twig may have fallen from a tree. Or... She shook the thought from her head and focused on her breathing. The pain was unbearable, and she gnawed on the knife handle to relieve her frustration. It was so consuming that she almost missed the second splash. This time, she knew it wasn't a twig, but she had to be sure. Slowly, she pushed herself up and edged toward the window above her head. Leaning against the seat, she peered into the darkness. The trees swung softly in the gentle wind. In the moonlight, everything was drained of its color. It would have been a peaceful sight, if not for the tall, dark figure standing in the shallow water. It faced away from the bus, its head tilted to the side as it swayed back and forth, as if listening to music. Feeling like her heart was about to explode, Claire began to lower herself back into her hiding spot. Just when her head was out of sight, the seat creaked loudly under the weight of her arm. She pressed herself against the floor, not daring to breathe. Within seconds, she heard it at the window. Its thin fingers squealed against the glass as it pressed its face onto the surface, searching inside. She could see it, but she prayed it couldn't see her. From her vantage point, she saw its black tongue snake out of its mouth and kiss the window. Then it stepped out of view. At first, she thought it was gone, but then she could hear it. It was inspecting every window, searching for a way into the enclosed space, for a way to join her. Through the methodic noises, a small tap here and a slight click there, she knew where it was. Before long, it would find its way to the door. The image of it prying the door open filled her head. Another wave of pain caused her to cry out, and the noise stopped. Knowing it was already aware of her presence, she decided to stop writhing in silence and let her screams fill the air, dropping the knife to her side. The baby was only minutes away. Her body pressed in from all sides. Claire expected it to break through the windows, provoked by the sound of her pain. As the seconds passed, she realized it wasn't going to force its way in. What was it doing? She closed her eyes, bearing through the stabbing feeling. When she opened them, she saw it standing at the window across the aisle from her. Its fingers were splayed wide as it stared at her, looking like a child at a toy store. It just stood there, watching. She'd rather it just end the pain. Why wasn't it attacking her? Was this the child she had seen born all those years ago? The thought frightened her, but she couldn't help but look for some sign of recognition in its terrible eyes. Before she realized it, her body pushed once again, and she felt the child begin to emerge. The thing outside began to sway, apparently excited. A lipless smile stretched across its face. Claire looked away, not wanting to see anymore. As she prepared for the final push, she grabbed the knife and held it poised, ready to meet her child. Within seconds, she was empty, staring at the baby on the floor of the bus. It was exactly what she had expected.
Their bellies had all flattened, and none had come to seed. Upon the breath of every man, dark words to be freed. Then the month of May, when milk teeth grew no more, until the night the dryness ended, seed replaced with spore. A perfume master poison, deception none could name, and through the blood it came to be, for a world it was to claim.